Sara leads the Open Knowledge Network, which brings together experts of the open movement globally. The network's main focus is the intersection of tech and democracy. At Open Knowledge Foundation, Sara also manages projects and supports open source and open data communities. She is very passionate about all issues linked to community care and health. Before joining Open Knowledge Foundation, she was advocating for public libraries to be on the EU agenda, notably for the review of the Copyright Directive, and was a part of the team of Bibliothèques Sans Frontières that developed Khan Academy in French. She is a proud organizer of csvconf for the last 3 years and Open Research DevRoom at FOSDEM. So thank you all so much, and let us hear from Sara.
Thank you all, and thanks, Chair, for the great introduction. Basically, today, I'm going to tell you about developing technology with the community. And to do so, I'm going to use the example of Open Data Editor, which is a desktop application that we have been developing in the past 3 years at Open Knowledge Foundation. I had prepared a slide to present myself, but Chair did that already very nicely. Just to mention, I'm based here in Bologna, just 3 minutes away from here, and these are some ways you can contact me. I know that this morning John said that we shouldn't introduce organizations and that we should jump directly into the flesh of things. But I want just to give you a little bit of information about open knowledge, because it's going to be then useful to understand a few things that I will mention later. So for those of you who already know open knowledge, I'm sorry if I'm going to repeat stuff for you. But for those of you who don't know, hopefully I bring some useful information. So Open Knowledge Foundation has been around for 2 decades now. We are a global nonprofit, and we're among the pioneers of the open data movement. What we do at Open Knowledge Foundation is that we build open infrastructure and open standards with the idea of improving the quality of data that is shared, so that data basically can easily be turned into information that can be used by people to produce positive social change. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So can you hear me? Good. So basically what we do, just in a nutshell, so we build open source technology for opening data. And because this technology is open source, there's a lot of community that gathers around those tools that we build. Apart from the community that directly are involved in the open source tools that we build, we also have a global community of people, what we call the Open Knowledge Network, who are organizations around the world that are mission aligned and value aligned with us. And together, what we do is that we advocate basically for digital infrastructure to be open by design. So as you can see, we work a lot with communities, but a lot of those communities are basically quite technical communities. We are also very specific about what we mean by open. Back in 2006, we released the open definition, which is a set of principles that defines what or when data or a content can be defined as open. And again, this was a community effort thought with people, and we have a council that now governs the open definition, which has been reviewed meanwhile several times. We develop tools as well. So one of them is CCAN. We have a lot of CCAN people here, so I won't myself try to explain what CCAN is. Please go and talk to them. But even if you haven't heard of it, probably wherever you're coming from, CCAN is the most used open data portal around the world. So although you might not be familiar, maybe you're using CCAN without knowing it. And those are other tools that we also developed at Open Knowledge Foundation with this idea of building simple, sustainable, and open by design technology. Once again, all of these tools require a community and have communities that gather around it. And once again, those communities are highly technical communities. So we've been developing these things for almost 2 decades now, and all of those come out of interactions basically with open data communities, with issues around, data publication and data transportation and all of that. So we can maybe safely say that we are kind of like experts when it comes to data friction. And I tried to summarize a little bit what those data friction could look like. So for example, when, and I'm sure that all of you in the room know this already, but like, for example, when data is shared without license, then it means that it cannot be directly reused. So of course, it's difficult. When data is shared without metadata, then it's also very difficult because it's hard to understand what is in the data set. When the data is shared without standard, it means that it's not very easily combinable. When you share it in proprietary formats, it means that I have to have a proprietary software to open it, which might not be the case. And of course, badly archived data, which is a tragedy that we all know. Sometimes even with our own data, we archive it so badly that we cannot find it anymore. So to do that, at Open Knowledge, we developed a tool called frictionless data. Frictionless data, which some people mentioned this morning, I think Marco, is basically a project with at the core a standard to containerize data together with the scripter. And this means that basically whenever someone is receiving this data package, people can directly reuse it without having to ask all the questions and without having all the frictions that you could see before in the comic that I shared. Frictionless data also has, because it's an open source tool, it has software implementations, and it has a big community that gathers around it. But once again, and this is something that I really want to sink in, it's a highly technical community. So it's made of a lot of like researchers, people in the public administration, but with a high skilled and programming profile. So we can safely say that data is messy, and this is still a sad reality in the 21st century. We have AI, we have people that go for journeys of pleasure in space, but we still have basically the same problems with data that we had since the beginning of tabulation. So starting from this observation, we started to look around us at Open Knowledge and a little bit beyond the communities we always work with. And we started to observe that there is a lot of people out there actually who are not the usual technical profiles we speak with or we interact with, but a lot of those people are actually people that publish the data that we consume. For example, in public administrations, there are a lot of people in the journalist and activist community also that use that data, but because they don't have the technical skills to basically automatize a lot of the tasks that you would need to prepare the data, they spend a lot of time basically reviewing the data sets that they need to use before those data sets are finally ready for them to be used and basically to move to the part of work that they're really interested in and they actually enjoy. So starting from this observation, what we decided to do was basically to build an application that could do it all, that could basically bring all the stuff that Frictionless was doing and even more, whatever you can think this application could do. So it would, review your data set, to validate the data. It would help you building maps starting from the data, maybe also producing, data articles, for example. And how we did this. So basically back in 2023, when CSV conference was in Buenos Aires, we had initial conversations with non-technical communities. So we started talking with a lot of people from GLAM, for example. We met, I think, the Wikimedia community from Argentina. And we started to understand basically what the pain points were for them, what they needed to try to shape this application. Once we gathered all of that, what we did was we started developing the application. And then towards the end of the year, we finally released a beta with Open Data Editor. Now, this seems like, a journey that makes a lot of sense. But one thing that I would say is when you see a linear development like this, you have to be quite skeptical about it. And if we really want to be honest about it, the Open Data Editor, especially now, looking back, it's looking much more like this, actually. And one thing that I want to really pause and let sink in is that, generally speaking, we tend to see a lot around in technological development, but not only, and this is something that I highlighted already in the last edition in Mexico City. We always hear about the success part of development. We always hear about the success also in our personal lives, but actually the road that leads to success is not as linear as one would think. It doesn't look like that at all. It looks like this. And somehow the failures are never shared, but the failures are a natural part of whatever we're doing. And I personally believe that it would make a lot of sense to actually share them a little bit more because there's a lot that we can learn from them. And I would say in our specific case, the community was an essential part of understanding actually those failures that we were doing. And so I'm going to try to share a little bit of those with you and share a little bit how the community helped us actually to really understand what our journey was. So going back to this, some of the mistakes that we did, for example, here were, so we started talking with people, as I mentioned at the beginning, our target audience, although the target audience was never clearly defined. We started developing the application, but then what we did was, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are used to interact with a lot of very technical communities. And so without even thinking, it was kind of like a reflex. When we started developing, the people with whom we would interact were the technical communities that we usually interact with. But those, of course, were not the end users. And that meant that when the beta was released in 2023, okay, we did it a little bit in a rush, so as it often happens. But basically, we said, okay, I mean, maybe we're not ready. There were a few things that were a little bit buggy, you know. I mean, we had all those features that I showed you before, the maps and the articles and everything. And we thought, okay, even to download the application, actually, you had to run a few line of code in the command line, which we thought, you know, we will just document it in the documentation. It's going to be fine. You know, people are just going to copy paste it and it's going to work. Well, clearly it didn't. And this meant also that basically the beta release was only tried out by people that were not the end users of the application. So you can see now how this apparently linear kind of like process went wrong in many different ways. So one thing that we also started thinking is, after this beta release, is, are we really serving the community that we want to serve? And who is this community, you know? Because I kept saying, okay, we want to build something for non-technical users, but who are the non-technical users, you know? This is a very general term. Who knows? I mean, also like, is a non-technical user someone that doesn't know how to code, or is it something else? So what we did basically at the beginning of 2024 is that we hired a very skilled product owner who arrived, Romina Coleman, and she said, let's stop all development. Let's stop here and let's take some time to basically do a proper user research and then restrain the target audience. And let's just say that this application, it's not going to be for everyone who doesn't know how to code, but let's restrain it to a couple of user types. And so we decided to really have an application that would be for journalists and activists mainly. So the first step was then to cut out a lot of the stuff that was there. It was very attractive to have an application that could do all those things, but things were a bit buggy. And also when you have to deal with people that don't have that kind of like technical background, there's a lot of stuff that they don't really need. So we started cutting out a lot of the features that we had and try to make the application as simple as possible for those users. And one other thing that we decided to do early on was also trying to interact as much as possible with our target audience and picking up actually a couple of organizations that would fall within this target audience that we had defined, and basically seeing with them over a long period of time, so 1.5 months, whether the application made sense for them. Because sometimes we did a lot of user testing as well, but sometimes when you have people using something over time, that's when you can really understand there are some things that can make a lot of sense in the beginning, but then are not really useful. And on the other side, there are some things that might be a bit of blocker, but actually at the end, when you start using it, they reveal themselves as something useful. So the two organizations with whom we've worked are ASIC, sorry for the Spanish speakers in the room, I'm going to butcher your language now, the Asociación Civil de Igualdad y Justicia, which is an association that does defense of social rights in Argentina. And what they do is that they develop this dashboard that you can see here, basically to monitor housing conditions in the country. And the problems that they had was that they had like quarterly data that dated from 18 years. They had inconsistencies over time in the data sets. There were a lot of like undetected errors that actually were distorting a little bit the findings that they were having. and also the preliminary analysis of the data sets just took them ages. So in that sense, Open Data Editor was really useful for them. And Story Data, which is a data communication project from Barcelona, Spain, where they also develop a dashboard, which is this one here, which is basically cross-referencing territorial data with family income and SDGs. And again, some of the problems that they had was that the data was fragmented, it was lacking standards, and there was a lot of like historical data which was designed more for humans than machines, so that made it kind of like tricky. And so we tested Open Data Editor together with them for 1.5 months, and the pilot idea was actually a winning one. So I would definitely recommend trying to partner up with organizations over a long period of time, if possible, to try to understand if what you're building makes sense and is a real solution. What we also try to do, because of course pilots can be resource consuming and also funding consuming, was trying to iterate with the community with shorter, let's say, interactions through user testing, documentation reviews, and also we did a big review with our network, with our international network. Interestingly enough, when we're doing this user testing and the documentation review, what we discovered is that a lot of people outside of our target audience was actually interested in using Open Data Editor. So people that we have thought initially as more technical people, like researchers, for example, were quite interested. Also, a lot of people from public administrations around the world, especially small and medium sized, who might not have technical teams, were also very interested. So basically, we then started 2025 this year with a new pilot program, really putting this at the heart of the development and devoting a lot of time. And we did this with 5 organizations, opening up also a little bit the target audience that we had. So we have the city of Zagreb, for example, who is using Open Data Editor to basically review their datasets before they're injected in the SIGAN portal. We had the Bioinformatic Hub of Kenya initiative, which is using with young researchers Open Data Editor to review genomic data. We had Open Knowledge Nepal, our chapter from Nepal, who was doing basically training for local government in order for them to be ready to publish data without having to pass by technical people. And then we had the Demography Project from Kenya, who are doing a study of pollution, air pollution and sound pollution collected from different devices. And to be able to combine it, basically, they needed a way to review basically the data set before they could be merged into a giant spreadsheet. And last but not least, the Observatoire des Armements, which is a French organization that is doing weapon spending monitoring, who is digitizing actually a lot of historical data. And that part is, of course, like very error prone because it's manually done by the volunteers. So those organizations, of course, reported like a big improvement of the work that they were doing through ODE. For example, the Observatoire des Armements noticed that whenever they were dealing with large and complex data sets, there was 95% reduction of manual work. Also, Open Knowledge Nepal reported that the public administrations that they were training actually increased efficiency when producing and publishing data. But the most, it's actually what we learned from them. So by then, by the beginning of this year, this is what the application looked like. So compared to what we were seeing before, you can see that it's already kind of like a bit simpler. And here I just put some of the feedback that we received. There were a lot of things that actually didn't make sense. So interacting with those communities, for example, we understood that, we had this, we thought, very clever way of marking when a data set contained errors or not. Terrible from the point of view of accessibility, and apparently no one noticed it also. So it's something that we got rid of. A lot of people reported that the ability to edit the metadata was actually something that was quite scary for them, because a lot of people don't know what metadata is, and whenever they entered and saw this sort of like giant grid, they just thought, if I touch anything here, I'm just going to break my data set, so I'll just ignore it and pretend that it's not around. And then also we thought of having an AI integration Basically, the idea there was like, let's make this application attractive. Everyone is using AI, so that will be something nice for people. But it turned out that a lot of our target audience at the end of the day was very scared about AI. They were saying, okay, if AI is inside here, does it mean that the data that I put in this application is shared online? How can I control my data? And so at the end of the day, something that we thought would attract people ended up rejecting them. So some of the learnings that we had from these interactions with the community and especially with the pilots is, first of all, that without iterations, solutions can actually have challenges. And it's always very useful to check basically with people whether what you think is a solution for the problem is really a solution and not adding an additional problem, actually. Something very surprising actually that came up was that, especially for people with less technical background and maybe less data literate, using an application like Open Data Editor, but any other application that would help with data, the logic of the application will actually shape the way that they would think about data. And so it can really help with data literacy. So it's useful to actually think about the way that we develop the application because it will shape the ideas that people have about data. The other thing is, of course, that navigation and design can go a long way. And this is especially true for non-technical audiences who really need the application not to be buggy, not to be too complicated, to be kind of like attractive and easy to use. But at the same time, and this is kind of like a tension that we observed, and I think this is probably true for a lot of people here in this room, we don't have, we're not a giant organization, we're a small organization, we have a small team working on this application. And so we have limited resources actually to devote to this. And so there's a lot of like user experience that would be really nice to have, but we can't really afford to have. So there's a lot of stuff that, for example, paying attention to the shade of a button or to the pixels maybe doesn't make a lot of sense, but you want to balance that as much as possible with an application that is actually accessible and understandable by users. And then, of course, don't be seduced by the latest tech hype. For us, it was the case of AI, but it was also the case of the frameworks that we decided to use in the beginning that ended up not making a lot of sense, but I'm going to speak about this in a while. So what Open Data Editor looks like now at the beginning, this was the last release at the beginning of August. As you can see, it's much, much easier. There's no metadata anymore. This is kind of like embedded in there. The application looks very simple, and we made a deliberate decision also to change the AI that we were using. So we ditched the cloud-based AI, and we decided instead to go for a local LLM, which, has its trade-offs because, of course, it's models that are much, much slower. But it made sense because it was kind of like aligned with the idea that we had for this application. This is a local application that people, for example, also in lower resource settings can use. For example, in case of, energy disruption, this can be used offline. So it made sense to have this AI feature also as something that can be used offline. But especially it was important to really mark what, in a transparent way, what basically like the application is doing and how the AI is working so that people can really understand what is happening with the data. We have a new round of pilot organizations that basically are focusing now on the AI part of it. So it's an AI of our own from Cambodia, the Indian Institute of Technology from Delhi, the Public Affairs Research Institute from South Africa, Data Critica from Germany and Mexico, and the Open Science Community Ghana. And those pilots are especially devoted to trying to understand how to make this AI part of the application as transparent and as usable as possible by those communities. The thing that we discovered also with this pilots organization is that most of the challenges actually out there are not only technical challenges. So some of the things that I would recommend that were really made clear by the interactions with the community is that, and this is very hard, try as much as possible not to make assumptions, try as much as possible to step back, try to listen instead of like thinking that you're understanding something when it's not there. Language can be a big barrier, and this language being a barrier has multiple dimensions in the sense that, of course, there is, it has to do with localization, for example, and the application being able to be used in the local language. We have it at the moment in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. But what I also mean here, which was something a bit more complicated for us to understand, is that the choice of words that you do can also be a huge barrier, especially when working with non-technical communities. In our case, I mean, I'm not a person with a very technical background, but there were a lot of like words that we were using that kind of like made sense to us, made sense to the communities we were interacting with, but were very scary for people that were using the application for the first time. Whenever they were seeing data validation, which is basically the only thing that this application is doing, they didn't understand what data validation was. When they saw something like execute a task, people were like, execute in what sense? What is happening here? And these are just some examples, basically. But so the choice of words must be deliberate and must be as inclusive as possible. And you have to really pay attention because being sometimes, you know, I mean, I've been at Open Knowledge for almost 5 years. I've been hearing those words all the time. And so I kind of like, I'm used to it. But for some people, they don't make a lot of sense. The other thing that I would mention is that there are limits also to barrier removal for non-technical aspects of an application. What I mean is there's always something that people will not know. And you have to accept at a certain moment that there are things you cannot explain everything. So we got a lot of questions during the pilots, for example, or even during the user testing, people asking us, okay, but what is a CSV actually? And when we're testing the AI model, people were saying, okay, you keep speaking about a model, but what exactly is a model? And maybe it's not our role as Open Data Editor, it's not the role of the application to explain all of this. And it's also good to kind of like understand this. The other thing, as I mentioned also in the beginning, is it's great to document everything and it's great to have fantastic user guides, but people don't read user guides. So this is something that you have to, I mean, make peace with. So when developing an application, especially again for non-technical people, it's very important that we think about the application being able to be almost self-explanatory, and so that people don't have to go to the documentation because probably they won't go there. And then last but not least, technology by itself is never enough to solve a problem. So with Open Data Editor, we try to solve one problem, which is data validation. But basically, for people to really make the most of data, we need to build tools, but together with the tools, we need to make trainings available so that people can really get the most out of them. So one of the decisions that we took was to build an online course, which is freely available online, developed together with our partners, the network members, Open Knowledge Brazil. And we have a module, which is a general module on best data practices, you know, just best practices, principles, and stuff like this with fun exercises as well. And then a second module which concentrates on how you can get there using tools like Open Data Editor. Some of the other things that we've been thinking about is how to build a community. And this seems like a very simple question. But once again, I mean, it's 20 years that Open Knowledge Foundation is building communities. But then when we arrived to a tool like Open Data Editor, which is a tool for technical communities, it's not as simple and straightforward as one would think, in the sense that it is very clear why someone would join a technical community in a way. There is a clear incentive of, you know, joining the CKAN community, maybe because you use CKAN, maybe there's something that you would like to put on the roadmap. It's a big project. So, I mean, there's some kind of like, prestige coming with it and all of that. But when it comes to non-technical communities, like what is their incentives for being there? And also, like, a lot of those people actually are not even used to online communities. They don't know what it is. So you have to explain to them, tell them the value, if there is any, and also what exactly would they do inside the community. So these are some of the things that we've been thinking, and we don't have a clear answer to it. So I'd be glad also to discuss with any of you if you have any idea around this. And we've been also this also triggered some thinking about the future, because a community also means that you make a tool sustainable by having a community around it. And this thinking about the future was really triggered when, at the end of last year, just before our stable release, basically one of our core dependencies just disappeared from one day to the other. So we're using this open source library on GitHub, and 2 weeks before the big release, it was gone and nowhere to be found. It's not something that is unheard of, I mean, things like this happen, but it really made us realize how fragile, basically, the whole infrastructure that we're using was. And actually, our tech lead, Patricio Del Bocca, wrote a very nice rant about it that I would definitely encourage you to go and have a read. But that led basically to us rethinking a little bit this application. And what I was talking about before, about the tech hype and not falling into them, we then made a choice to basically migrate the architecture of Open Data Editor from a React-based application to something much, much simpler, which is probably less shiny, but it's using a framework that has been around for 20 years that doesn't have a lot of updates. And that led to a code simplification and a reduction of 66% in our code base. Now, again, this is kind of like a tension and a trade-off in the sense that the application is now much more easily maintainable. Someone who comes in can it's much easier to familiarize oneself with the code. But it also means because it's an old framework, then there's probably less people that would want to contribute to it because it's kind of like less attractive to them. It's much more shiny if you can say that you're a contributor to a React-based application, for example. And so all of this, also thinking about contribution, thinking about the community, it's really how we started thinking how we can make sure actually that the tools that we develop can survive even without us. And part of that is probably through the community as well, making sure that that the application is solid, but also making sure that there are people that care for it. And this led actually to an initiative that we launched at the end of last year called The Tech We Want. Again, this was started by a rant from our tech lead, Patricio Del Bocca. And we launched it with an online summit in October last year. This is a screenshot of it. And the idea of The Tech We Want is to have basically a conversation with the community, especially with the technical community, but not only, to rethink maybe altogether how we can build technology in a different way. So the observation is, at the moment, you have a lot of technology available out there, which has many layers of complexity. And this can be extremely useful when you have a complex use case, which requires a complex solution. But the reality today is that a lot of the stuff out there, even if you want to solve the simplest problem, you have to adopt a full stack of things that don't always make sense, especially if you look at it from kind of like sustainability and cost, in the sense that it has labor costs, it has financial cost, of course, it has sometimes an environmental cost as well. So all things that we kind of like need to take into consideration. And the idea of The Tech We Want is let's maybe try to build or rethink the way that we're building tech to build something that is useful, that is simple, that is long lasting, and that is solving people's real problems. The thing that we believe is that in the open knowledge space, we really share a responsibility to use our own resources wisely and to build tools that can be learned by all people and used for as long as possible. So that's more or less it. One last thing that I wanted to mention is that I've been here talking about Open Data Editor, but actually Open Data Editor is a collective effort, and I've done very, very little of what I've talked about. This is mostly the job of other people. So I just wanted to acknowledge the current Open Data team, Open Data Editor team at Open Knowledge Foundation, and our past team members as well. So Romina Coleman, who's our product owner, Patricio Del Bocca, who's our tech lead, Nicolas Bases, who's our senior dev, and Lucas Petti, who's our communications director. We also have past team members that have contributed to Open Data Editor, so Edgar Zanella, Evgeny Karev, Faith Kenny, Gergana Chachkova, Polina Ganina, Sassi Garti, and Madlon Hulsebus. I also want to mention that a lot of the failures that we were allowed to make were also, we were able to make them thanks to the Patrick McGavin Foundation, which has decided to support us. You can go and have a look. They have like interesting funding as well. And of course, the effort to get Open Data Editor to where it is now goes much beyond the team of Open Knowledge Foundation. And these are all the people that helped us getting where we are now. I'm not going to read them all because otherwise we're not making in time for lunch. But there's a full list over there with a link. And yeah, so that's it. Thank you all. I've put some of the links here, how you can get to Open Data Editor, the GitHub repository, School of Data, where we host the course that I was talking about before, the Tech We Want, and then the Open Knowledge Foundation website. There's plenty of ways you can get in touch with us, so please do. And besides me, there's another colleague of mine, Andres Vasquez, in the room, who's a senior dev. Here he is. So if you want to have a conversation, please go to Andres as well. And yeah, that's it. I don't know if you have any questions, but thank you.